I would like to acknowledge that we are on the traditional territory of the Comox First Nation. Tansi, hello. My name is Suzanne Camp. I am Métis. Quite a few years ago, I was asked to explain to a group of children how long Aboriginal people, Indigenous people, had lived here along the Pacific Northwest coast. And I realized it was a long, long time, and I wanted to make a visual representation of how long that actually was. At the time, archaeological evidence had found that at least 10,000 years of human habitation and travel along the coast had been found. And recently, more discoveries have found that it goes back to at least 14,000 years, which is just incredible. So how could I do that? How could I make a child understand how long that has been in human terms? And what I came up with was a bead timeline. No words, just beads. And so my bead timeline actually contains 500 beads, which stands in for 500 generations of people, at least 500 generations. And each bead on the timeline is very, very tiny. It's only this big. Each bead represents one generation of people, 20 years, from the time a baby is born till the time the child grows up and can have a child of their own. So, to start with, we're going to go back in time. And every time my bead timeline changes color, that will mean we've gone back 5 generations of people, or 100 years, or 1 century. So let's start our journey back in time. Every time, remember, all of those people, all of those generations were living and working and telling stories and moving along the coast, making their homes. And the storytellers told the stories and remembered the history, and the traditions were passed on, and the culture was passed on. When we got this far back, which is 2,000 years ago, that's when the calendar that we use nowadays was started. And yet look at all that time before, all of those people who lived here, who lived everywhere, passed on their traditions and their culture and their stories, and all through oral tradition. As children listened to these stories, they grew up, and then they became the storytellers. And so it was through speaking and listening and remembering, and speaking and listening and remembering, people passed down their history and their stories and their traditions. Going back further and further in time, 1 century at a time, we get to this bead. Now this bead represents something that most young children really know about, which is the pyramids that were built in Egypt. And for us, we think Egyptian pyramids are so old, but really this bead represents only 4,500 years ago. Further back in time, we're going further back and back and back, remembering all of those people, the history that was passed on, not through written word, but through the spoken word and the memories. Keep going back in time. Now, something very interesting was happening to the world 10,000 years ago. It was the end of the last ice age. And all the world, so much of North America, was covered with huge, deep sheets of ice. But as the world warmed up, the ice started to melt, and the water ran down into the ocean. The ocean levels had been very, very low because of all of that water that was trapped in the ice on the land. But as the water flowed into the ocean, the land was covered, the land that people might have lived on and traveled on and worked on. And so over time, the human habitation actually disappeared. And today it's still there under the ocean levels. This story also can be about how the earth warmed up. Now here on the northwest coast, the people that lived here started to become known as the people of cedar. They called the tree, the cedar tree, the tree of life. But the world took a long time to warm up, so it was only about 6,000 years ago that the earth started to warm up enough for people to start using the cedar. And they used it for their homes, for their canoes, for their household goods, for their clothing, all of those things. And they passed on that knowledge all the way up to the very present time. The story can also tell us about the history of the Comox Valley. Out in the estuary of the Courtenay River, there's the remains of a huge network of fish traps. Those fish traps, more than 100 or 200,000 pieces of wood have been pounded into the earth, and it shows us that the Comox Valley has been used for a very long time for the people who lived here so long ago. Now when we look around at the Comox Valley as it has become in the last 150, 160 years, things have changed very, very much. And we have changed the Comox Valley so much. If we look at the mining and the fishing and the farming, all of those things have made such a heavy footprint on the earth. And yet, for thousands, 10,000 years, there was hardly any footprint, a light footprint only, that was left by the First Nations people. If we think about that, and we think about how things have changed, and we look at how long the Comox Valley has been here, this is when people who came from outside came to live in the Comox Valley. 8 generations compared to 500, and what a change that's been.